Welcome everyone at this webinar of our series, Author Meets Readers. Very happy to see you today. So we're all online usually. So today we're trying something different. Some of us, Eva and I, are in the CRIMT seminar room. So I hope the technical issues will be all good, but I'm sure they will. So thank you so much. We're very happy to welcome today a discussion of Valeria Pulignano's and Markieta Domecka's new book called The Politics of Unpaid Labour. The book came out in 2025. For those of you who have not had the chance to read this book, it's fortunately all available, open access. We will put the link in the chat. It's a wonderful book that has part theory, so the theory of unpaid labor, but also draws on a lot of empirical work, a lot of field work that really makes it comprehensive to understand what underpins the theory that the authors put forward. So today we have the pleasure to welcome three readers. So Blandine Émilien from Bristol, Mathew Johnson from Manchester, and in the room with me, Eva Kocher, that is from the European University of Viadrina in Frankfurt, but right now in Montreal because she is on a research sojourn here in Montreal. So the way we're going to proceed today is, and I'm Dalia Gesualdi, for those who don't know me. Hi, my name is not on the screen, so I will introduce myself formally, CRIMT director. So we're going to start by having a brief presentation from Valeria Pulignano. She has a PowerPoint to share with us. Then the three authors will present their observation, comments, and questions. We will again open the floor to Valeria for a few minutes to answer those comments, and then we open the floor and the chat to you. So if you have questions or comments that come along the way, you can put them in the chat or open your microphone and your camera, or just your microphone as you wish, at the end of the presentation. We hope to have at least a good 20-25 minutes to have an exchange and a conversation with all of you. So if that's okay, as per process, everybody can hear me fine? That's good. We're good on the perfect, excellent. So Valeria, please go ahead and share with us your PowerPoint. We've tested it before. Everything should be good on that front.
Thank you very much, Dalia, and really thank you to CRIMT for organizing this webinar and for having me here. And thank you very much also to Eva, Blandine, and Matt for kind of agreeing to discuss the book. So I'm really, really looking forward to receive your ideas and further comments. So I will try to share. Hopefully we'll be okay. Yeah, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so yes, the politics of unpaid labor. Well, first of all, let me kind of introduce a little bit unpaid labor. Well, unpaid labor, as we know, is a term, is a concept which is very much embedded into labor studies from different perspectives, sociological, socioeconomic, and legal studies as well. In particular, what we see here is the way in which labor scholars have been kind of approaching unpaid labor has been quite different, in fact, reflecting the different disciplinary, I would say, approaches to some extent. On the one hand, the most kind of used way to approach unpaid labor has been from critical feminist studies, looking at unpaid labor as socially reproductive labor. On the other hand, we also do have in industrial employment relations, labor studies, and also I would say labor sociology, a kind of understanding of unpaid labor as wage theft. And also free labor. Now, wage theft of free labor, what is this about? Is about illegal underpayment or no payment of legally owned wages to employees, which can take different forms. For example, overtime, underpayment of minimum wages, also unpaid social benefits, and also misclassification of workers. And we do know that this misclassification of workers has been something that since the last decades have been, kind of pervading a lot of studies around the gig economy. So what we try to do in the politics of unpaid labor is to try, in fact, to look at the, I would say, interdependencies between these different forms of unpaid labor. Unpaid labor, the way in which we define it in the book, is specifically related to, I would say, wage debt, in the sense that looks at time and effort that people spend to undertake tasks which are part of their own job description, so within the kind of inside the area of the labor market, and for which people are under or unpaid. But we also relate this form of unpaid labor inside the market to the unpaid labor outside the market, which is the socially reproductive labor. And we look at the conditions, we look at the kind of processes, dynamics, the so-called politics, which in fact underpin the undertaking of this unpaid labor, and the way in which these kind of new interdependencies between different areas of unpaid labor, how and what do they mean, particularly in terms of precarious work. Now, the way in which I would try to tackle this kind of aspect is also to my view, kind of reproposing what we normally know me as an Italian sort of, or more broadly European scholar, but I would say in Britain, particularly in the UK, there is this expression of the chicken and the eggs. And in fact, this is, the kind of way in which I would say probably the politics of unpaid labor makes sense. Now, what is the egg and chicken story here? Well, in order to understand the egg and chicken story, we should probably look at two important pieces of work. One which was written by Paul Gomberg in 2018, which was in fact a chapter in an interesting handbook on distributive justice. And in this chapter, in fact, Paul Gomberg says very clearly that many individuals endure unjust harm through their labor, including inadequate compensation that denies workers a dignified livelihood. So de facto, Paul Gomberg already put a kind of emphasis on the fact that people suffer unjust harm through their work, which is in fact reflected through poor wages, or sometimes even no wages at all, precarious conditions, and also lack of recognition, all of which compromise human dignity, and also what he talks about, equality. Now, the equality story here, let me just very briefly introduce, because it's quite interesting, and it links directly to the inequality story we have also in the book. Inequality here is actually looked in two different ways. So it's not just a story, I would say, of material deprivation, but it's also a story of symbolic devaluation. And he recalls to some extent the kind of terminology or term which was introduced by Nancy Fraser, a very interesting lady scholar, feminist scholar, sociologist, looking at what she calls the bivalent injustice, where in fact she looks at these kind of economic misredistribution and also cultural misrecognition as being at the core of the problematics, the social problematics that people, kind of face in our society. Now, aside the work of Paul Gomberg, we have also the study done by, and the interesting work done by Atmos Rosa, who is a critical sociologist, critical theorist, who in 2015 wrote about social acceleration. And there, in fact, he talks about, the kind of effect of social acceleration, particularly deriving from the introduction of digital technologies into the daily life, work and life on individuals, and also from the fragmentation of work tasks and employment forms in the labor market. Now, what is the egg and chicken story here? Well, I think that what we see here from these two pieces of work is that on the one hand, precarious and unjust labor conditions are increasingly shaped by this acceleration. And here we could think in terms of platform work, which in fact breaks down work into small tasks, but also obscures employment relationship and pushes wages down. And on the other hand, we have in fact the very logic of acceleration of which Rosa is talking about, which is in fact driven by this technology and many other things happening in the labor market, and which in fact depends very much on labor that is flexible and also underpaid. paid and segmented. So we see a kind of conceptual tension here, which makes a lot of sense. And we see, in fact, the kind of paradox to some extent, in the sense that on the one hand, we see acceleration in terms of technological acceleration, which promises efficiency, and therefore, by realizing this efficiency, also should deliver in terms of freedom, particularly time in terms of freedom for people, but which at the end results in greater inequality and harm. And this is exactly because the efforts that people spend to survive in this accelerated society reproduce the very injustice that, in fact, Paul Gomberg is talking about. So people work, but they don't receive enough from their own work that, in fact, harms them rather than enriching them in terms of making, them in trouble, not receiving even free time for the work that they are developing. Now, the question is why all this is happening? Well, we know what is at the roots of all these. Marx told this a long time ago. This is called exploitation. Exploitation is the fact that people create more value than what they receive in wages as a result of the fact that there is destruction of surplus value from workers. But the question is, does exploitation tell all the story? Well, de facto exploitation doesn't tell all the story, because as we know, in fact, and this was at the core, is at the core of critical feminist studies, basically there is an ideological limitation when we look at exploitation in the way in which, in fact, was developed in classical Marxist and industrial relations theory, particularly, because, in fact, there was kind of, reproducing this kind of dichotomy between productive wage and non-productive of unwage or socially reproductive labor. And just to give you a kind of illustration about two, I think there are many scholars who have been, of course, talking about these, but just, to pick up two from an Italian and a British sort of tradition here, the work of Silvia Federici, talking about the wages against housework, where she also, in fact, criticizes this false dichotomy between unproductive or socially reproductive and productive labor. In fact, she says, care and domestic work, they say is love, but actually we say this is unwaged work, so unpaid work. On the other hand, the work done by, in fact, Rosemary Crompton, particularly the empirical work she did on gender and the family in relation to these male breadwinner models, which shows, in fact, how families adapt to economic and policy shift in ways which reproduce unequal divisions of labor. And Crompton particularly illustrates that even when women enter paid work, the ideological weight of the breadwinner model persists, shaping, in fact, expectations and outcomes for women. And she frames it by talking about this dual burden that women have to support. And just to give you an illustration, because we found a lot of this dual burden in our work, particularly looking at care, residential care in some countries, particularly UK and Germany. I will go back to that later on if I have the time to do that. But I just wanted to give you some illustration about these. I mean, what you can see here from these two quotes from Chara and Mary in the UK, two carers in the residential care in the UK. We see that women here in residential care actually face this dual burden when waged work is layered on top of continuing unpaid care responsibility, leaving them, in fact, both financially, I would say, fragile and emotionally strained. In fact, this is reflected in Chara quotes, which highlights that the pay is another weight for the weight of responsibility that she has to carry on, but also Mary, which describes the exhaustion of meeting residents' diverse needs, only to return home to further care duties, which underscores, in fact, the vulnerability which is produced at the intersection of low wage and, in fact, caring demands, which could be, in fact, very exhausting for people. So what are the kind of implications which comes out of all these? Well, certainly there are three important implications. First of all, we need to reject this kind of ideological distinction between productive and reproductive reflexive work, the dichotomy. We also, and this means we need to include unpaid, gendered, and invisible forms of labor, but also particularly we need to recognize that, welfare state, households, and markets, they co-produce labor arrangements. Now, what does this mean? Let me just spend 2 words on this. And this is very much also what we see in our work. I mean, labor arrangements are not natural outcomes of the economy, but they are configurations produced at the intersection of policy, welfare policy, family strategies, and employer and worker practices. For example, thinking about part-time work for mothers in Holland, one of the Benelux country, which is next to, the country where I'm living. Basically, the prevalence of part-time female employment in Holland, everybody knows, that in Holland there is almost 90% of part-time that women, kind of take. Now, this prevalence of part-time female employment is an arrangement which is actually co-produced by subsidy structures, family strategies, and employer offering. Now, on the side of the subsidy structures, what we mean here is that childcare is in fact expensive, but partially subsidized under specific employment conditions. On the side of the family strategies, many couple adopt and 1.5 earner model, which means men full-time and women part-time. In fact, 90% almost in Holland. And from the side of the employers, what we see here is that employers normalize part-time contract by making it the default in jobs design, scheduling, contracts, and also workplace culture. So here we see how, in fact, this interacts, this kind of strategies interacts with household strategies, work-care balances, welfare policies to sustain, in fact, what we call the Dutch part-time equilibrium. And we could go, looking also at other examples in other parts of the world, in Europe, particularly in my country, Italy, thinking about the elder care in Southern Europe, where, in fact, we see that the widespread figure of the migrant care worker emerged from the lack of state provision. So the fact that, in fact, in terms of welfare state, there is limited public provision of formal health care. The family reliance on private solutions, in fact, so families hire in Italy migrant workers to provide 24/7 leave in care, and the segmented labor markets, which means, in fact, that there is a strong availability of low-paid migrant workers, which are, in fact, willing to accept informal or semi-formal conditions. So that's what I mean when I talk about these labor arrangements, which are not a natural outcome of the economy. Now, another dichotomy which the book tries to, I would say, uncover is the dichotomy between waged and unwaged labor in terms of paid labor inside the employment relationship and outside employment relationship. What is the outside an employment relationship? Labor, this is in fact labor which is developed, undertaken by self-employed people, particularly. Now, we see these particularly in the platform economy, and we see these, taking shape around what we call being this called of organizationally engineered tournaments. Where in fact we see that in this kind of scenario created by the platform economy, the distribution of rewards is contingent on relative performance rather than guaranteed outcomes. So in this sense, we see in fact very much aligned the argument of David Mardison about the the kind of a labor market traditional tournaments model, where labor markets are structured around, in fact, this hierarchical competition where these rewards in terms of permanent employment, promotion, financial gains are distributed according to this performance rather than these outcomes. But what we see particularly in the digital economy is that when the people enter the digital economy, freelancers enter the digital economy, this kind of situation exacerbates, and exacerbates particularly for those platforms that they use algorithm mediated technology, which in fact amplify the pressure and precarity which is created by the market, the competition in the market, by creating even distortion of this competition in the market in economic terms. So the digital tournament here framework reveals that precarity is not merely a product of low wages or not only, an intermittent contract, but also is socially, institutionally mediated through platform design. And here, just to give some examples of some work also we have been doing together, particularly with Mathew Johnson on digital tournament in platforms. We had a paper published in the Cambridge Journal of Economy on that. We see, in fact, that here you have a table which is, taken also from the book, where we see, in fact, that some platform, particularly Upwork and Headlands, which they use these, algorithm-mediated technological tool. We can see here. You can see the form of unpaid labor, which are reproduced by, or they are reported by people, these freelancers who do their own work, and which is in fact mainly, covering communication with clients, buying platform currency, sending free samples of work and many others. But what is interesting here in the percentage of unpaid labor, which we measured, we see that in fact on Upwork and Headlands, people report to do much more unpaid labor in comparison to other platforms, which are not tournament platforms, so where the, in fact, algorithm-mediated technology doesn't work in a such pervasive way. So this means, in fact, that technology, algorithm actually mediated technologies means a lot in terms of the unpaid labor that freelancers do and undertake when they deliver their own work through platforms. Now, so going back to the book, as I said before, we try to link different forms of unpaid labor, or different forms of unpaid labor undertaken in different areas, I would say, of the market. Let me talk about market here. So inside the market and outside the market, by trying, in fact, to overcome the dichotomies that I've been talking about before, we look at the interdependencies between these different unpaid inside and outside the labor market. And we do it by reflecting upon how can we make sense of it from a theoretical point of view. And the solution that we give to this, how do we make sense of it from a theoretical point of view, is to actually approach work from a relational perspective. Here we use very much the work done by Miriam Glucksmann, which in fact started to look at this relational perspective in work when she in fact related paid and unpaid labor, particularly socially reproductive labor and waged labor inside the market. So she was not looking at the unpaid labor inside the labor market, but she tried, to kind of look at this continuum in terms of socially reproductive and not socially reproductive labor. And in fact, also what Miriam Glucksmann, I think, quite interestingly said is that, we need to look at this work from a relational point of view, which means to look at paid, unpaid in this kind of continuum. But we need also to be aware that all the time that things are changing in the labor market or in society overall, in terms of the introduction of new forms of work organization, the introduction of new business strategies, new technology, and so forth, we need to be prepared to relook at what kind of new interdependency are created between the area of paid and unpaid inside and outside the market. And we took this kind of challenge, if you like, trying to make sense of this continuum in an era of, complete transformations. Now, the politics, as I said earlier, before, is about, in fact, it reflects the material conditions, but also the cultural processes, the symbolic devaluation, where people, in fact, are then kept into specific, I would say, social status, which are actually not valued and devalued. But we also look at the, in fact, conditions and material conditions, as I said, which shape this unpaid labor. We also look at the political, and the political here is about the policy intervention. Well, if you like, the political here recalls what I talked about before when I was telling about the fact that labor arrangements are not the natural outcome of the economy, but they are framed around welfare policy, around household strategies, family, and also employer and worker practices. So Burrow would here probably talk about, using a different terminology, but nevertheless, that's what we use. Now, what we're trying to do in the book is by, developing these and looking at these new interdependencies, we try also to develop a critique, and that's why we talk about the theory of unpaid labor. So a critique of how the new social division of labor depends on and justifies this or underpaid labor. Now, our main goal was to try to see to what extent unpaid labor looked in this kind of interdependent way, how these, whether this and how it matters for precarious work. So the question was to see, what is the rationale, what is the relation between unpaid labor and precarious work. And the main motivation of it is simply also because now we do know that there has been and there is study that have been in fact pointing to the fact that unpaid labor of course entails precarious work. But the question whether and how precarious work automatically unfolds from this unpaid labor, we thought that is an empirical question, because it depends really on the kind of conditions of people, depends on the resources that people have on their own disposal, to what extent are they able to mitigate the effect of this unpaid labor. And third, last but not least, again, how do we relate unpaid labor inside the market with the socially reproductive labor? So what does it mean for a woman having to, undertake unpaid labor inside the market, for example, in care, residential care, and doing also, unpaid labor in domestic work? The kind of analytical framework we developed before is this one. I have to say that, when we started our analysis of the data, we didn't have in our mind any, kind of idea that while linking unpaid labor to precarious work, we would have had to look into inequality, particularly class-based inequality. This is really something which, was developed by the analysis, which is quite interesting as a result itself. And as I said before, we looked very much at these conditions and processes underpinning unpaid labor. We use theories of the ideal worker norm, stigma and hope. I don't have the time to go into that, of course, here, but that's the theories we have been using. And we have been also using theories about the struggle of recognition here. Now, let me perhaps say a little bit more about this. Now, the ideal worker, stigma and hope, well, de facto, all these theories then entail to one kind of basket, if you like, which is in fact looking at the normative frameworks, which again are very much taken into account, have been taken into account in employment industrial relations theory as well, when looking at the way in which, the adherence to established rules, norms, and shared values within a particular system, which could be an industrial employment relations system, fosters legitimacy and stability. So that's why we refer to this normative framework. But on the other hand, the struggle of recognition comes really from taking into account this kind of symbolic, more cultural, if you like, processes as well. Now, struggle of recognition comes into play by the work which has been done by Axel Honneth, which identifies, in fact, the struggles for recognition in social conflict that arrives from the lack of or violation of recognition in different spheres. And here the spheres that, Honneth considers are the love, the private sphere, the rights, the legal sphere, and the esteem, solidarity, or more social sphere. And of course, here in each of these sphere, what we see is that people, in fact, struggle. They struggle against, abuse. They struggle against discrimination. They struggle against the fact that they don't have their own rights recognized. They struggle against, the competencies that they develop and they have are not valued, are not recognized and taken into account. Now, we link these struggles of recognition to the resources, of course, that people have at their own disposal in terms of individual and collective resources to mitigate the effect of unpaid labor that in certain areas of work they have to do and they are actually undertaking. From an empirical point of view, and there comes also the political, if you like, We developed our analysis by using biographical narrative interviews, and also in order to collect and to quantify on the unpaid labor, we also used working diaries, which workers in different work areas, particularly the creative and cultural industries, dance and others, residential care and freelancing platform work in different countries that you can see here on the slides, have been collecting and keeping for us. And this has been a very interesting source, very rich source for let's say, revealing and quantitatively speaking, the unpaid labor. I don't know how I'm doing with the time. Hopefully I'm doing well.
You have a few minutes left.
Oh, okay, okay. So, okay, let me say very briefly, in a nutshell, what this book tells in terms of whether and how unpaid labor, in fact, account for precarious work. Well, what do we see here? As I said before, we cannot talk about precarious work. We talk about inequality in precarious work. And this is the way in which we see, empirically speaking, unpaid labor creating precarity, which means, in fact, that only, that social class mediates the occurrence of unpaid labor, particularly the way in which unpaid labor then creates precarious conditions for the workers that they undertake it. And this is general in all the three work areas we have been looking at. Social class here is particularly, let's say, operationalized in terms of social status, occupational prestige, particularly for the freelancing. And here prestige reminds us also the concept of Weber, and gender, which plays an important role. But also what we see here is that the context, the welfare and regulatory industrial relations, employment relations system in which these workers perform and undertake unpaid labor matters a lot to explain the extent to which and how unpaid labor brings precarity to them. And this is because, in fact, let's say, industrial relations, employment relations structure, and welfare, they shape whether this unpaid labor can foster employability or arrest these workers into this precarious job. But we also see other two interesting things. We see that it's not, the social class and regulatory story is also mediated through business models, generally speaking, which in fact they matters a lot when we talk about the social class. So business models, for example, in digital economy, and also I would say in residential care and in creative as well, they matter in making the class story visible. But particularly in the freelancing platform work, they matter in polarizing class-based differences when these freelancers actually undertake work through platform. As I've shown before, this means that working, through platform means for certain people belonging to a certain class to be kind of more easily having to get into precarious conditions when they work through, in fact, digital, I would say, tournament platforms than when they don't work through digital tournament platforms. The household story is also quite interesting. And the household story here, in fact, recalls what I said before in terms of the labor arrangement. So what we see here is that the welfare state policy, in fact, is very important in terms of sustaining family strategies, but also employers and workers' practices, as I said before, they kind of play a role. In particular, the employer business models play a role in normalizing what normally often hides class-based inequalities. And that's why we see these, if you like, sort of, arrow going, on the same directions. Now, just to give you some example, what does it mean in concrete? Well, let's look at the case of dance that we have been investigating in Sweden and in Holland. Now, the employment arrangements of dancers in these two countries can be very different. We have a prevalence of project workers in Holland vis-a-vis employee in Sweden. Being an employee in Sweden, of course, means in the majority of the cases have to work for state-funded dance organizations, which are very prevalent in Sweden. They are not so much prevalent in Holland, where project worker mainly is prevalent. And of course, this means that for a dancer having to work in funded dance organization as an employee, this dancer has much more access to social protection in terms of, individual grants possibility, but also, social protection overall. And this social protection comes not only because of being an employee, but also when these people are not employee, they are self-employed people. And the reason why is that is because, in fact, in Sweden, unions and the role of the unions is quite important here. Unions have been able to create some sort of, if you like, organizations that they help, in fact, these dancers, even if they are freelancers, to kind of have access to unemployment insurance fund in moment of an activity. And this is quite important for them to protect them. Now, how the household enters this kind of, if you like, more broader scenario, where we see, in fact, for example, and this is particularly the case of Holland, that, for two dancers, which actually are in a kind of household, which is a double income household, but these two dancers are, in fact, for example, project workers. That's the situation, particularly in Holland. We see that these dancers more easily get into precarious conditions, especially those with children, as they cannot count on generous state support in the form of child benefits, also housing allowances, and free childcare, which is the case in Sweden. And also what we see here is that in Holland, some of these self-employed people even sometimes don't have the possibility to be covered by Social Security, as they cannot afford to even pay the contributions. And I will just I don't know whether I have time here to show that this situation is particularly worse for women. And it's worse for women because of the business model where, these dancers have to work, which is extremely, I would say not generous in terms of making flexible arrangements for women. So at the end of the day, for women, the problem here is that they have to work extremely longer hours, whether they like it or they don't like it. This is, of course, the way in which also they have to, they are in a situation that they cannot afford even to send their own kids to crash, because it gets extremely expensive for them, because it's extremely long hours they have to work. And of course, this creates a lot of difficulties for these women, particularly, again, as I said, in Holland. This is not the situation in Sweden. So there is a gender story here. Perhaps very quickly, if I may get
very, very quickly, Valeria, so we have time for discussion.
Yes. So just to present some empirical illustration of the quantification and the form of unpaid labor. We have a work extensification story in dance. We have a work intensification story of unpaid labor in care, and extensification and intensification in freelancing. Now, in creative dance, in fact, is work extensification, as this lady, Lisa in Holland, says, where traveling time particularly is unpaid, everything is unpaid, working hours, you work and you are not paid, and you have to do all these kind of things because this is a necessity. There is if you don't do that, you risk the exit. And this is very, in fact, particularly the situation that sometimes women have to face. In terms of quantification of this work extensification, you see the different forms of unpaid labor on the column. What does it mean in concrete? Is traveling time, but is also keeping in shape. So going to the gym, which becomes even a cost, not refunded. And many other things like overworking, creating job opportunities, network, and so forth. And this accounts for a lot of unpaid labor, 64% being the top, with personal investment work. For care is not only a story of extensification, but is also work of intensification. And the intensification comes very clearly as a result of two things. On the one hand, the moral obligation that, in fact, these women carers, they feel when they work and they have to provide services to their clients. For example, here, Marianne in Germany says, well, I have to come earlier in advance, and I want to come early in advance to work, so I gift my employer each day half an hour. But the reason why I want to do it is because I don't want to get in stress. And I want also to ask to the people how they are. So also the kind of intensification comes in the fact that everything has to be done in so short time, lifting, carrying, putting down, whatever, as Julia says in Germany. And also what we see here is that, and this is very much said by Tina in the UK, in fact, in so short time where, you would expect that more people should be here, but de facto, we are only a few of us that have to do this kind of job. In terms of quantification, you can see here, also here, forms of unpaid labor, unpaid overtime, particularly important, coming to work early, but also, again, as I said before, work intensification, working as an all-rounder, doing everything that needs to be done in so short time. And of course, emotional labor, which was reported 74% of the carers during our study. Now, these might be biased, as I say always when I present this slide, because in fact, we conducted our study during the COVID. So you can imagine why emotional labor is so high. Also here, when we look at the role of industrial relations, we see an important gap between Germany and UK. Of course, in Germany, the situation is much better. Unpaid labor is better mitigated by women, but nevertheless, we see a common story. And the common story is done by the fact that, to be very short, this job is unpaid, is low paid, is not, is really not paying enough for people. People at the same time, they have to pay their own costs. They have childcare to pay that they cannot afford. And this is not just the situation in the UK, it's also the situation in Germany. And thirdly, and is quite interesting, perhaps, to see that at the end, this is a job for women. So that when you actually are in a situation like the situation of Beate, when you have your husband that can take care of you, you are even questioned why you do this job in residential care. For example, Beate says, thanks God I have an husband. But when the colleagues ask them, what does he do? He works at Mercedes. Oh, why did she come to work here? So they are even questioning where she's working. So she could actually not work and not do this kind of job, which says a lot. Now, I will probably stop here, but what I want to stop is with this slide, because I want to show how we theorize the combination, how do we link unpaid labor with precarity. We theorize it by saying that we see a non-binary relationship between unpaid labor and precarity in dance, and we see a binary relationship in care. What does it mean? Regardless of the institutional context, we see this means that in care, in dance, of course, being part of an elite, as dance is, you are supposed to have the resources to support yourself and to support the unpaid labor. And this is in fact why we talk about non-binary relationship. These people have normally resources to support the unpaid labor, which in fact enable creative unpaid labor. But this is not the case of care, where in fact we see that this is not happening. And particularly workers are struggling to sustain unpaid labor, which became unsustainable for them from a material point of view, but also from a symbolic point of view. And this is the way in which we see the class getting reproduced through the prestige, elitarian status in dance, and the gender role more specific in care. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I think we could have had a 3-hour presentation on the content of the book, because as I said, there is a lot of empirical material in there. Thank you so much, Valeria. Nicolas Roby put the link to the book because it is all accessible, open access. So please feel free to download it right away. So I'm going to turn the floor to Blandine Émilien to give us her comments, questions on the book. Go ahead, Blandine.
Can you hear me well?
Very well.
Super. And thanks very much, Dalia. It's a real pleasure, as you know, to be here today, especially to highlight my reading of this very insightful book. Of course, within 10 minutes or so, it will be difficult to pay the right amount of justice to the rich content of this book. Thanks for the presentation, both in terms of the theory and in terms of empirical evidence. I was kind of selective and I would like to touch upon a couple of observations that I collected and thought through while reading this book as one reader within my own reader interest. Please bear this in mind. What will follow then is an attempt to contribute to the discussion through 3 main avenues. I will first highlight some of the strength of the author's postulate and contribution. Second, I would offer some brain-picking material in relation to one caveat that I may have identified. And third, I will complete my intervention by suggesting some links and further application of the book's contribution based on my own research experience. So one aspect that makes such work long due is its capacity to touch upon the macro level structures while affording much space to micro level and individual stories. at the Work and Equalities Institute 6 Fairness at Work conference in Manchester in January 2025. I remember that Richard Hyman and Rebecca Gumbrell-McCormick called for European trade unions' need to rethink their capacities and repertoires of action in terms of the level of inclusiveness and new attention to groups which, as Silvia Federici would argue, tend to be left behind. I recall asking Richard and Rebecca in the same conference how this will be operationalized methodologically by ongoing research if EU-level policy-related projects and neo-institutionalist approaches fail to capture individual stories and fail to enter the meanders of people's real versus HR-described experiences of work. And Hyman pointed to the need to be flexible and make sure to do both, that is, simultaneously and henceforth adequately touch upon the macro and the micro. In a way, Pulignano and Domecka's project was already behind the curtains of the employment relations stage and was coming with this initiative. And their endeavor is a success because in this book, the authors managed the articulation between how workers make sense of their work as activity enshrined within a personal life story, and the systemic foundations as well as the structural blockages deployed within a capitalist system that impacts on these workers' agency. So thanks for this. And as such, this book highlights the critical connections between unpaid labor and precarity in multiple forms by allowing us to understand how contemporary shapes of work are also premised on the meaning workers afford to their jobs. Pulignano and Domecka's book, I find, gives additional flesh to Lazar and Carlson's 2022's meaning of work postulate. They do so by demonstrating the fine-tuning we require as researchers to better capture both the common and variegated meanings of workers' understanding of their subjective experiences, often diluted and misconceived within overarching ideological assumptions nurtured under capitalist structures. No, not all workers experience stigma in their allegiance to the ideal worker norm in the same manner. No, researchers are not equally available to workers for them to show resilience in the face of legitimated and normalized precarity. And no, not all workers have the same face and same life stories in a so-said globalized regime. Variety has been underrated in our macro-level endeavors, and this book comes as a timely reminder that we ought to crawl in the coal mines with the miners, as British scholar Christine Edwards once did, and more recently shared with me in a narrative about her exciting academic career. While this book highlights our need to unpack the unsaid about workers' constrained agency, it reminds us of the situated elements that allows precarity to endure and be socially reproduced over time. And this is why this book is important in our attempt as researchers to tap from a framework that helps better understand the realities of distinct industries, the systemic impact of different institutional settings on specific industries, while in our onto-epistemological posture, we could do better at not dehumanizing or taking for granted workers' complacency with unpaid labor. Believe it or not, on my way to a data collection activity last night, I slept at friends whose 27-year-old son living at their place is a British actor. And this actor's great-grandfather happens to have been Einstein's dentist. So you can see where I'm going with this personal information. Passion, devotion, and unpaid labor, as Pulignano and Domecka demonstrate, is subjectively experienced based on the safety net or resources as resilience material that are made available to individual workers. This actor's enthusiasm and confidence in their profession, despite unpaid labor cracks, did not match those of the care workers I have met in Quebec during the pandemic. And perhaps, if I may, there was room in Pulignano and Domecka's work to indulge more in Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital, which more unconsciously has shaped workers' definition of their labor, including legitimated unpaid labor within the creative industries. Workers in creative industries would change their narratives maybe about themselves as dancers if the traditional notion of cultural capital surrounding ballet dancing was revisited in societal ideology. When Valeria presented this book at the International Labour and Employment Relations Conference last September, my attention was caught with how Valeria presented some of the data. Unpaid labor or particular activities were presented with action verbs. Workers were no longer having a rest, but were said to be doing rest and doing many activities that are often left unlabeled as labor in our daily lives. Critical ergonomists focusing on how workers socially regulate their workplace have been better than us human resource management or employment relations scholars at pointing at the doing rather than the being to better highlight workers' physical and mental investment at work. I'm hoping that Pulignano and Domecka have set a new trend and practice in our research agenda, thereby encouraging finer grain and more realistic accounts of labor and the reduction of invisibility, or to borrow Norbert Elias's words, concealment of what precarious workers actually do. I'd like to brainpick Valeria regarding one conceptual choice made in the book. From the beginning, the authors make a point of highlighting the class-based and bidirectional relationship between enduring unpaid labor and precarity. Yet, you know me, I could not but help noticing that while the book hails the importance of considering how workers identify to their labor in a tone akin to that of social psychology, and how they build their activities around and with work, it appears that the authors, to some extent, not in absolute, shy away from the notion of intersectionality in their theoretical framework. Gender was present, and yes, there are passages in the book that account for gender and race as elements that lead to further division within social class, but I was surprised to observe that a closer look at the extended intersection of identities, which by that I mean more than two forms of identities, was at times conceptually avoided. So recently, Nicolas de Genova suggested a rereading of the Marxian perspective on class and value to move away from the critical but classic analysis and challenge the economic calculation of labor's worth. Instead, or in addition to this focus on the economist's endeavor, de Genova contends that one should not only question how labor is said to be worth, but also consider why labor keeps being put into the situation of potential for exploitation. Pulignano and Domecka do ask a series of why. However, it is tempting to imagine that that why takes us back not only to how workers define their labor, but also to who they are and where they are coming from. If the migrant status is left behind by the system in which they operate, migrants' individual set of identities, stemming, for example, from their ethnicity, I would argue, needs to be put to the fore. Veiled slavery, as de Genova explains, is not only due to globalization, but the enabling factors that cultivate globalized activity. One of these factors is the identity-related, racialized, sexualized division of labor that sends the message that there will always be an underdog group that will take the job if the dominant identity sulks at them. And my argument here would be that acknowledging the political primacy of class should not eschew the profound interplay of the identity and class, and this requires equal attention to processes of racialization and not only to sexualization. The book does touch on these workers' gender or migrant identity to some extent, but I would like to hear Valeria's thoughts on my comment here, both about the role of cultural capital in shaping unpaid labor and creative industries, and the need to afford acute rather than soft importance to what I call extended intersectionality within our class-based analysis. All this said, I could not refrain from appreciating the contribution of this book and attempting to revisit my own research experience through its lens. I would like to introduce this by alluding to one research activity in which I was involved over the past years. It's about the analysis of migrant workers' experience in undertaking dirty, dangerous, and demeaning work in industrial slaughterhouses located in the Canadian province of Quebec. Through this research, which culminated in a short documentary publicly available on the CRIMT website, with my colleague Catherine Lemercier, filmmaker, we shed light on both visible and individual experiences of workers whose stories differ slightly from those of local workers due to the integrated presence of their migrant status within their employment trajectories. This case is peculiar and harbors contradiction because at face value, workers are hired within a HR process that is regulated as per the Quebec employment legislation, and they are even unionized upon arrival in Canada. At first sight, their situation is underpinned by seemingly standard employment contractual agreement and can be viewed as being away from precarious conditions experienced by However, when we dig further, we see other activities that these migrant workers in Quebec have had to do to maintain their employment and activities that are not accounted for by their employers. Workers do temporary migration and the job insecurity attached to their employer-specific work permit. Workers do silence in the face of bad conditions. Workers do long-period family separation. Workers do loneliness and other psychosocial consequences, among others. In other words, to sustain waged labor, workers embark on a series of non-work activities which require important effort that remain non-compensated. They end up ensuring employer retention for their employers and constitute exemplary migrants, the ideal work of norm. Pulignano and Domecka's new book helps demystify what has been legitimated due to the capitalist endeavor to normalize atypical conditions within ostensibly standard employment contracts. Pulignano and Domecka remind me of the importance of individual life stories, as well as the importance of engaging in multidisciplinary work within employment relations. Individual life stories have to nuance how we co-construct our institutions and legal framework, while small success in law and policy amendment will help us rewrite these multiple stories, hopefully with a pen of hope towards better work. And thanks for your book.
Thank you so much, Martin. Very interesting comments. I'm sure Valeria is going to have a lot to pick up, but I'm afraid we're going to lack of time. We should have booked a full day for this author meets readers. So I'm going to hand it off to Eva here in the room with me. So go right ahead.
Yeah, well, thanks to Dalia and CRIMT for the opportunity for this interdisciplinary discussion, and to Valeria and Markieta for the book. Which I think touches on some exciting questions, very relevant for labor law as well. I'm a labor lawyer, so it was a pleasure to engage with it. And I will also pick some issues and start with also 3 points the book kept me thinking about. So the first one is the concept of unpaid labor, which Valeria and Markieta are reintroducing kind of into the debate. So there have been lots of conceptual proposals around similar issues like reproductive work, care work, invisible work. So using unpaid labor is kind of a fresh perspective, and from inside work relationships that are also rather atypical. That's the second point I thought was interesting. By looking into creative dance, residential care, online freelancing, you make work environments visible that have rarely been researched. So you provide a feel for work activities, the work organizations, the motivations of workers that are often left out of the picture in labor research. And you tell very specific stories of very specific workers. So I like that kind of storytelling. It's very close to what lawyers do. We are not always looking at the representative, but looking at single stories of individual people. And I loved reading this. The price for this approach is that it's very hard to draw general conclusions from these individual cases. For example, residential care work, platform work, I have worked a bit on, we could also have told other stories, but you develop your own typologies out of your interviews. So that's also a very nice approach of taking some stories and developing some typologies out of them. And I think the stories we get to know are worth this price of lack of generality. The third issue that struck me was the role of stigma and I would say work ethos. I think, in fact, that is what the book really comes down to for me, and what we can learn from these studies. I will explain why I think so, but first look at the concept of unpaid labor that you use as your through line. And I will admit at the outset that I'm still not completely convinced that that concept helps us analyze questions we could not analyze without that concept. Well, because we usually associate unpaid labor with private care work and reproductive work. Now, Prabha Kotiswaran has defended one should not really use any other term than reproductive labor. I don't agree really with her, because I think it always depends on the question you're asking. So depending on your research interest, one concept will lend itself better than the other. And it's not always the concept of reproductive labor that is the best for the research question. So by looking at the research question that you promote in the book, so I will ask how this concept of unpaid labor works for them. That's more or less the question your subtitle poses. How can the study of unpaid labor help address inequality in precarious work? And first, there is a bit of a confusion I had when reading through it, because you, with good reason, introduce unpaid labor as a very broad concept, covering work on the market, in the market, and also reproductive work in the private realm. But really, after all, your work and your research is on the labor being performed on the market. Reproductive labor only comes into the picture as the context, as the lack of resources, as economic and social context. So in fact, you are talking about unpaid labor and socially reproductive labor on very different levels of your analysis. You have good reasons for always rather using the term socially reproductive labor for the work outside of the market. But then the concept of unpaid labor for in-market, I was wondering at times if it was really about the labor or if it was rather about pay, the pay part of it. In some instances, for example, when you're analyzing unpaid labor in freelance work, it seems to me mostly a problem of low pay rather than the labor being done. So that's why the terms wage theft, income theft often come to be used rather as an equivalent for unpaid labor. And we could say, well, why it's that important? Well, it's important for me as a lawyer because it kind of impacts the solutions we would come up with. So I was asking if this is rather a question of working time and recognition of working time, like, for example, the traveling time you mentioned, or we could frame this as a working time issue and solve it legally, theoretically. And in other instances, it might be rather about pay. Apart from that, there are lots of other policy consequences that your study points to. These are, I think, very interesting. This is what also Blandine talked about, the linking of the micro with the macro level, because you make a very clear argument pointing to the resources of people and showing us how they are constituted by social, economic, political welfare conditions. So that's how your work ties in excellently with the capability approach. So I consider this book in that respect a contribution to studies on precarious work, maybe rather than unpaid work, unpaid labor. There is, however, one issue where I think that this term unpaid labor really opens up a new perspective in the study of precarity and capabilities, and that is what you call stigma, and what we could also call work ethos, and what refers to worker subjectivities. I think this is a very exciting part of the book and the empirical research about it. I was a bit wondering about also the agency of workers, because in the research we did at my center with anthropology research, also in individual cases of care workers' strikes in hospitals, we found that this idea of an ideal worker, of professionality, of work ethos, was not just a constraint of agency, but it was also a resource of resistance that workers have. And I think some of your interviews also show these resources that this idea of the ideal worker might give them, not only in creative jobs, but also in any other job. So this ambivalence between agency and its constraint, that I think is very interesting. And the concept of struggle of recognition that you mentioned now, I think is an interesting counterbalancing perspective in that respect. So thanks a lot for the book.
Thank you so much, Eva, for these other comments and interesting questions that put into play. So I'm going to turn the floor to Matt Johnson online. Matt, the floor is to you.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Perfectly.
Great. Okay. Right. Let me just get rid of that. Yeah. I mean, thanks for inviting me to this, and to Valeria as well. I've worked with Valeria and Markieta on the project surrounding the book, and they've already heard some of my thoughts and comments on the book already. But just to say, it was actually really nice to go back to it again after kind of 12 months of reading it intensively the first time around, and hearing people's different takes on it in this session. And I think what that kind of signaled to me anyway was that in some ways it takes more than one read to really understand and get to grips with everything that is within the scope of this project. It's so encompassing, and there's so many levels to it that it actually benefits from, you know, multiple rereading. But I think once you've done that, once you have got to grips with it and you kind of absorb some of those key messages, in a way you can't unlearn them, you can't unsee them. By which I mean it really alerts you to the various kind of pervasive ways in which unpaid and underpaid labour have become completely normalised and embedded within, you know, different countries and industries. And this is a point that Damien makes in the conclusion. It's not just a marginal or residual practice on the edges of the labour market. It cuts across a whole range of industries, high and low wage industries, across employment, self-employment, large and small employers, public and private sector. So it is something that's running throughout the economic system, really. And I think once your eyes are opened to that, you know, maybe I was being slightly naive before, but you start to see it everywhere. You see in the multiple ways in which it's kind of manifested. Anyway, I was just going to kind of reflect a few points about the contributions of the book in slightly mechanical fashion, but covering theory, empirics, and policy. And the theoretical scope is very impressive. You know, the range of material that's in there. And I'm not a sociologist by training at all, but I think the book does a very good job of bringing into dialogue some of those broader Marxist literatures around labour power, class, you know, value production, and so on and so forth, with more specific feminist perspectives that connect work with the social reproduction. And what I think is a really powerful contribution is to show how precarious work is not solely an individual issue. It's sustained and potentially counteracted by these broader social and economic structures and resources that Valeria talks about in the book. So that includes the household, personal networks, and social capital, systems of welfare. And those resources we know are not evenly distributed. And picking up on Eva's point, actually, about whether this is about wages or time, I think in some ways the theoretical analysis is about time. And it's the way in which we think about what is considered valuable and what is productive and therefore likely to be paid, and what's not valuable and therefore likely to be unpaid. And I think that there's a point made by Chris Tilley in one of the previous reviews and in discussions with Valeria, that generally speaking, women tend to have less time or less control over their time than men, and that's a point well made. But I think to speak to Blandine's point, there are obviously intersecting inequalities, class, gender, race, and age, among other things, that means some people's time is valued less than that of others, and that applies both in and outside the labour market. In terms of the empirical contributions, and this was where I was very kind of interested and engaged. Particularly the empirical stuff really spoke to me. And I think what's really fascinating is to see how unpaid and underpaid labour is produced and reproduced in very particular ways in different countries and different industries, reflective of the way in which work is organised, how labour power is deployed, the contractual relationships that surround those industries, those professions, dance, care and freelancing, and all the multiple negative effects that can arise from that. And what's interesting is the subtle different ways in which it happens. So this isn't necessarily just a case of straightforward wage theft, but it's these kind of cumulative costs that people build up over time of just going to work. So whether that's the unpaid waiting time, having to pay for their own training, doing their own fitness regime, buying the materials, searching for jobs, invoicing people, paying for childcare. These are all things that add up over time. And I think the book should be commended for not falling into the trap of telling just a story of hardship, exploitation, precarious work and misery. It would have been relatively easy to repeat that story that's been well made by others. But I think what we see is the everyday realities of work, as well as the narratives and rationalizations that workers build up over time, the way in which they see and view their jobs, their lives, the meaning that they attach to work. So there is this interesting interplay of structure and agency, and the sacrifices that people make for the sake of some higher purpose, whether that's the three empirical chapters, the sake of art, the sake of others, and the sake of reputation. So it's beyond just a kind of transactional experience. It has deeper meaning and deeper significance of that. And perhaps to echo Eva's point about the ways in which workers have agency, the ways in which they cope and resist precarious work, I was wondering what scope there was for collective resistance to unpaid and underpaid work within such a diverse and fragmented and potentially atomized workforce. And I think that leads into a broader point about the policy contributions or the policy framing of the book. And I guess what we might describe as being the macro politics of unpaid labour. So the empirical chapters really talk to the micro politics, but I was also interested in the macro politics. And I think the book is an important wake-up call. It really is a kind of alerting us to something that is fundamentally wrong within the labour market and the broader economy. And it requires us to put some pressure on the powerful actors, be that employers or the state. And that's not just about kind of closing technical loopholes or enforcing existing rules, but raising fundamental questions about how employers and the state are reproducing these contradictory ideal worker norms and embed the notion of stigma within the labour market. And I think there's clearly an imbalance between the moral obligations that are being placed on individuals and households to find work, to find better work, to progress, to achieve, to earn, to support their families, and the lack of obligations placed on employers to create decent, secure jobs that provide a reasonable standard of living for workers and their families. So I guess a question back to Valeria would be what you see as being the political paradigms maybe that have allowed unpaid labour to become so normalised. Is this just a quirk of history? Is this something inherent to the capitalist system, or is it more of a recent phenomena related to labour market activation and welfare conditionality? Because I think the notion that work is an inherent good is something that has become quite a dominant feature of political and public debate, and the idea that social and citizenship rights are conditional on economic contributions has become political orthodoxy, and that's something we need to be aware of, and we should be willing to challenge that wherever we can. So thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for these very generous comments. I think we have a lot to discuss upon. I see the time running. Valeria, if that's okay with you, I'd like to open the floor. I know you already have a lot to say, but to the participants, if anyone has any comments or want to ask a question to Valeria, you can please raise your hand or put it in the chat while... There we have a visitor in Blandine's office. So
my life is exciting.
How are you? We'll say hi to you formally.
Hello.
So does anyone have a comment or a question to put in as of now? Or you can raise your virtual hand, your yellow hand, or your other colored hand. And 1, 2, 3, or else I will turn the floor to Valeria. No one yet? Perfect. So Valeria, I'm going to ask you, and this is going to be quite a feat, to try to answer these comments and questions. I think you have maybe 3 overarching questions that came from all of our 3 readers. Maybe in 5 minutes. I'm not going to cut your microphone, but if you can try to synthesize in 5 minutes, it would be great. And then any questions or comments, please feel free. So go ahead, Valeria.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to Blandine, to Eva, to Matt. I mean, really insightful comments, very, very good comments, and make me also thinking broadly about, you know, how to move on with our work. So not everything has been done. There is a lot that is still to be done. On the issue on Blandine, I mean, I would perhaps touch upon the important point of intersectionality, which I fully agree. And this is, of course, something that the book doesn't engage strongly with intersectionality, but it's not because the book doesn't like intersectionality or we didn't, you know, consider intersectionality. The reason why you know, we didn't really engage strongly with that is because intersectionality, at least to our view, seems to explain more how social and political identities create unique sort of discrimination and privilege. And perhaps, you know, in our view, kind of, which was in fact to try to explain the motivations and meanings which are assigned to this discrimination and privilege. So to our view, we felt that the use of the ideal worker norm, which is in fact based on this, you know, distinctive and kind of study that we have been doing empirically, by looking at the motivations and meanings the workers with different identities, of course, associated with unpaid labor. So we felt that probably, you know, we should have made a choice. But of course, I fully kind of take the point on intersectionality. And there is something that we are thinking upon intersectionality. So there would be something that we will be reflecting upon. I don't have much time to move on with 5 minutes, but regarding the Eva points about, well, 2 things. Thanks to Matt for, you know, giving already the answer. I would build upon that. One thing on the generalization, I see the point, but again, you know, the idea for us was not to, again, I don't want to repeat myself, you know, it's not aimed to reach statistical kind of a way of thinking about generalization, but really, you know, to kind of look at the stories of these people. So, you know, the in-depth analysis in that sense for us was, you know, quite interesting without, you know, aiming, as I said, to this generalization. By the way, in our now second part of the project, we are building on generalization by looking at unpaid labor more generally in a statistical way across all the different working population in some countries that we are investigating. So you will hear a lot about that. Regarding the story, in fact, as Matt said, is a story of time. You know, I don't want to reiterate what Matt said. Is a story of time. Is a story of, you know, what is considered to be valuable, what is recognized by, you know, by as being, you know, something which contributes to what we conceive being productive or not productive. So there also there is a scope perhaps to rethink critically about, you know, what is, you know, what do we consider to be productive. And also the way in which society also looks at what is valued. And here I think that, again, the story of the creative industry vis-a-vis care is quite interesting. Society recognize the value of a dancer if this dancer will become famous, is an artist, right? But for a carer is a problem. So this work is not actually taken into account. But at the end is a question of time. And perhaps another thing I want to say is a question of time at the macro level is a question also of market as well, in terms of competition. If you look at the story of the freelancers, for example. And here I would perhaps say one thing, which to me particularly is very important, because it reminds me when we went and presented the results of this study to the European Commission, and people started, particularly when we presented the story of the freelancers, they started to say, well, where in fact, as you also said, Eva, so what do we need to do? It seems that is a question of the market. So is the market, right? Or is the wage, or is the time? Well, actually it's a bit everything, but the point is that we need to be attentive not to separate these areas, because as soon as we think it's a question of market, then we don't look at the employment conditions. So we actually say, well, we need to fix the market, is not our competence. And I think this is very, very, very bad. This is not where we want to go. Particularly when we look at freelancing, we look at self-employed people, and that's why we argue for this overcoming the dichotomy for people working inside and outside and kind of traditionally considered employment relationship. We need to kind of rethink that. In terms of the last point of Matt, where what do we can do is inherent to capitalist system, is a labor market issue. Well, I think it's a bit of both, in the sense that now, if I would see to what kind of work, particularly now, I'm thinking in terms of economic sociology, but also political economy of work more generally, to what kind of work our work actually looks at. Now, the work of, for example, Jens Bakers on imagined futures, right? About, revealing this kind of dynamic. So how these dynamics of capitalism are reproduced at the very, very individual level. Well, Jens Bakers talked also in the imagined future about hope, about expectation, how these expectations the people have for future are actually linking into capitalist dynamics. And this is where we are going to. So we are talking about macro level dynamics, which of course they link also with the macro level in terms of market structures and labor market in terms of, in fact, labor market structures, which I fully agree with Matt, they don't work. And I think the book is probably, at least to my view, a contribution of telling, okay, why they don't work. Just to give an example, going back to the issue of the value for society, a dancer vis-a-vis a carer. Well, in labor market, we have structure, trajectory of professionalization, which in some countries exist, in other countries do not exist for these carers and nurses. And we see, in fact, that these also, this is not what we have been doing in our work, but there is plenty of work out there which have been looking at how this also entraps, let's say, women in this kind of very diabolic sort of structures. So we need to really look at work. We need to rethink in terms of value of work. We need to rethink in terms of what is productive, not only for economic models, but particularly for humans. And there is a lot out there. People talk about human-centered everywhere, human-centered models, linking it to even artificial intelligence now, technologies and climate change and whatsoever. But nobody really says what do we have to do? What does it mean human, right? And I think that this is where we probably need to go and deliver in the future. And it is about, that's, I think, is probably a mission for the future. I don't know, but I would stop here. Thank you very much for all the
Thank
comments.
you. We have a question in the chat, and it's a question, I think, to links to a comment that Eva made also on the policy perspective. So the question is, what is the way out you would be suggesting for the complex problems of unpaid labor? So very small question, but go right ahead and help us tackling it.
Well, I mean, we did a video, which I think is now posted on the CRIMT, generously enough, on the CRIMT webpage, where we try to point exactly the policy recommendation. One of the policy is reduction in working hours. You would say, how does it fit with unpaid labor? Well, we see that a lot of people are actually, in order to kind of afford, in order to combine work and life, they work longer hours during the weekend. So we need to reduce the kind of dependency on unpaid labor by, in fact, creating structures which in labor market foster and sustain work-life balance. And this is, again, something for the human-centered models. So I would say we need to create a box out there in work-life balance and tell exactly how does it look like in a situation of changing, work, employment forms and all these kind of things. There I think labor lawyers can really, and have been already, there's a lot of work about the right of disconnection at the European level, people talking about all these kind of things, but still, how we go, how do we enforce these kind of things, how do we make business models being able to sustain these practices is the problem. And I think there is not one solution only. We need to tackle the problem from different side and from different perspective. And again, reduction in working hours could be one thing. By the way, this is something that we will be kind of exploring further in the next year and a half as part of a new ERC grant, now I can say, Restless, which will try, based on these database we are constructing on data. These are quantitative data with working population in the UK, in Sweden, in Holland, and in France. We actually have been running our statistical module on unpaid labor, on time, material, immaterial dimension, and trying, to look at, we are looking at what does it mean to do unpaid for work-life balance. And of course, we will be trying to look particularly at this aspect of the reduction in working hours, which is something that, I know many other people are at the moment working on, and I think is a quite interesting aspect. So, hopefully something will be delivered on that. I don't know, hopefully. Thank you.
I'm sure it will. Thank you so much. So I don't know if anyone has other comment or question before, and Nicola just put the video that is posted on the website of CRIMT, but is now also in the chat. So I think I'm going to conclude by thanking Valeria for being here today, our three readers, Blandine, Eva, and Matt, and all of you also for being here. It was very insightful, and we will have other events in this series of Author Meets Readers, so please stay tuned. Thank you again, and I wish you a pleasant weekend. For those in Europe, the night is starting. For us, it's a little rest of the day before the weekend. So thank you very much, and talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.